You think you know World War I, the trenches, the mud, the gas. Young men ground into paste by machine guns while old generals sipped brandy miles behind the lines. A tragic accident, you've been told. One assassination spiraling out of control through alliance systems nobody could stop. A meaningless slaughter where everyone lost. You're wrong about almost all of it. The truth is darker, more deliberate, and far more relevant than the sanitized version you learned in school. This wasn't an accidental war. This was a chosen war. And the men who chose it knew exactly what they were doing. They just had no idea what they were unleashing. Before we reconstruct how European civilization tore itself apart, I need something from you. If this deep dive into the catastrophe that created our modern world is something you want to see more of, hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what's coming. And I'm genuinely curious, where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments. I want to know who's joining me in this excavation of the war that ended the old world. Now, let's talk about what actually happened. Picture Europe in the summer of 1914, not the powder keg you've heard about. Picture prosperity, picture confidence, picture a continent that had avoided major war for 43 years, that had resolved crisis after crisis through diplomacy, that believed it had evolved beyond mass slaughter. The concert of Europe had worked. Sarajevo was just another Balkan incident, the assassination of some Austrian archduke nobody had heard of until he was dead. The Belle Époque, they called it in France. The beautiful era. Paris glittered with electric lights and avant-garde art. The Eiffel Tower stood as monument to technological achievement. The metro had just opened. Parisians sat in outdoor cafes discussing philosophy, literature, the latest innovations. Motor cars were replacing horses. Airplanes had gone from impossible dream to reality in just over a decade. The world was accelerating into modernity. In Britain, the Edwardian era represented imperial confidence at its zenith. The British Empire sprawled across a quarter of the globe. The Royal Navy ruled the seas without serious challenge. London was the financial capital of the world, the pound, sterling the currency that mattered. Industry hummed, trade flourished. Social reform was addressing the worst excesses of industrial capitalism. Democracy was expanding, slowly, grudgingly, but expanding nonetheless. Germany was an industrial powerhouse. In just 43 years since unification, it had transformed from a collection of agricultural states into Europe's economic dynamo. German chemistry led the world. German steel production exceeded Britain's. German universities attracted scholars from across the globe. German music, philosophy, and literature represented high culture. This was the Germany of Einstein and Planck, of Wagner and Strauss, of Thomas Mann and Hermann Hesse. Even Russia, backward Russia, was modernizing. Industrialization was accelerating. Railways were spreading across the vast empire. A nascent middle class was emerging in the cities. Yes, the autocracy remained brutal. Yes, the peasantry remained desperately poor. But the trajectory seemed clear. Gradual reform, eventual constitutionalism, economic development. The revolution of 1905 had forced the Tsar to create a parliament. It was weak, it was limited, but it existed. Change seemed possible. This was the world that went to war in 1914, not a dying civilization eager for suicide, a thriving, prosperous, optimistic civilization that believed it had transcended the barbarism of previous centuries. International institutions reflected this confidence. The Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907 had codified laws of war, established mechanisms for arbitration, created frameworks for peaceful dispute resolution. Nearly all major powers had participated. They had agreed on rules. They had signed treaties limiting weapons, protecting civilians, providing for neutral mediation. Norman Angel's book, The Great Illusion, published in 1910, argued that war between modern industrial nations was economically impossible. Trade had made economies too interdependent. Credit systems were too interlinked. The costs of modern war would exceed any possible gains. Rational nations would never choose economic suicide. The book was a bestseller, translated into 25 languages, discussed in parliaments and universities across Europe. Angel became a celebrity intellectual. His thesis seemed self-evident to educated Europeans. War was obsolete, progress had made it so, and then everything broke. Except this time, someone wanted war. On July 5, 1914, 9 days before Austria-Hungary would issue its ultimatum to Serbia, the German Kaiser gave what historians call the blank check. He told Austria-Hungary they had Germany's full support for whatever they chose to do to Serbia. No conditions, no restraint, whatever you want, we've got your back. This wasn't sleepwalking, this was eyes wide open. But understand the context behind the blank check. Kaiser Wilhelm II had reason to believe Austria-Hungary needed support. The dual monarchy was a creaking, multi-ethnic empire held together by Habsburg tradition and imperial bureaucracy. Magyar nationalism in Hungary, Czech nationalism in Bohemia, South Slav nationalism threatening from Serbia. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand wasn't just murder. It was challenge to imperial authority. It was message, your empire is vulnerable. Your legitimacy is contested. We can strike at your royal family with impunity. Franz Joseph, the 84-year-old Austrian emperor, had ruled since 1848. He'd seen his empire survive revolution, war, and internal crisis. But he was old now, his heir dead, his empire fraying. His military advisors told him, assert authority now or lose it forever. Show strength or appear weak. Weak empires don't survive in the Balkans, and Serbia was the problem, or rather, Greater Serbia nationalism was the problem. The dream that all South Slavs, Serbs, Croats, Bosniaks, Slovenes should unite under Serbian leadership in a single state. This dream threatened to tear away Austria-Hungary's southern provinces. Already, secret societies like the Black Hand operated across the border, spreading propaganda, recruiting agents, planning violence. The Black Hand had organized Franz Ferdinand's assassination. Serbian military intelligence had equipped the assassins, trained them, smuggled them into Bosnia. The Serbian government might not have ordered the hit directly, but they knew it was coming and did nothing to stop it. So when Germany offered the blank check, Austrian leaders saw it as green light. Germany, the mighty German Empire with its powerful army, would deter Russian interference, would make the localized punishment of Serbia possible, would prevent this from becoming a continental war. They miscalculated catastrophically. The Austrian ultimatum to Serbia, delivered July 23rd, was designed to be rejected. It had to be rejected. It demanded Austria-Hungary have control over Serbian internal investigations, over Serbian courts, over Serbian sovereignty, the equivalent of Britain demanding to run American police departments. Unacceptable by design. The document was 48 hours of legal prose designed to strip Serbia of independence. Article 5 demanded that Austrian officials be allowed to participate, not observe, participate, in Serbian investigations of anti-Austrian activities on Serbian soil. Article 6 demanded that Austrian representatives be allowed to take part in judicial proceedings against conspirators. This was direct violation of Serbian sovereignty, of the fundamental principle that states control their own territory. Serbian officials read the ultimatum with growing alarm. Some wanted to reject it outright, die fighting rather than become Austrian puppet. Others saw nuance. They could accept most of it, show willingness to cooperate, appeal to international opinion, make Austria look like the aggressor. Serbia accepted 8 of the 10 demands anyway, tried to negotiate the rest, offered international arbitration. The Serbian response, delivered just before the 48-hour deadline expired, was masterwork of diplomacy. It agreed to suppress anti-Austrian publications. It agreed to ban societies engaged in propaganda against Austria-Hungary. It agreed to remove from military service any officers guilty of anti-Austrian activity. It agreed to arrest specific individuals implicated in the assassination plot. It agreed to almost everything and couched the few rejections in language emphasizing Serbia's desire for peaceful resolution and willingness to submit disputed points to international arbitration at The Hague. Britain thought the Serbian reply removed grounds for war. Germany's Chancellor called it capitulation of the most humiliating kind. France found it reasonable. Russia considered it grounds for diplomatic settlement. Austria-Hungary declared war 4 days later. Because this wasn't about the ultimatum, this was about the decision already made to crush Serbia. The ultimatum was pretext. The rejection was irrelevant. War had been chosen before the assassination, before the ultimatum, before the reply. Serbia's capitulation only proved they were weak enough to be destroyed. And here's what you need to understand about that moment. Multiple off-ramps existed. Britain proposed a conference. Russia offered to negotiate. The mechanisms that had prevented war in 1905, in 1908, in 1911 were still there, still functional, still available. Germany activated the Schlieffen Plan instead. This was the poison pill at the heart of European military planning, a German war plan that required invading France through Belgium within days of any conflict with Russia. Not because Belgium threatened Germany, because the plan demanded it, because German military planners had decided years earlier that any European war meant attacking France first, defeating them in 6 weeks, then turning to face Russia. Count Alfred von Schlieffen had designed the plan in 1905. His logic was brutal but clear. Germany faced enemies on 2 fronts, France to the west, Russia to the east. Fighting both simultaneously meant defeat. But Russia was vast and slow to mobilize. Its armies needed weeks to fully deploy. France, compact and efficient, could mobilize in days. So, strike France immediately. Avoid the fortified Franco-German border. Instead, sweep through Belgium and Luxembourg. Attack France from the north. Encircle Paris. Force surrender within 6 weeks. Then transfer all forces east before Russia fully mobilized. Defeat France in the west, then defeat Russia in the east. 2-front war solved. The plan had 3 fatal assumptions. First, that Belgium wouldn't resist. Second, that Britain wouldn't intervene. Third, that France would collapse quickly. All 3 were wrong, but by August 1914, the Schlieffen Plan had become Germany's only war plan. They had no alternative, no contingency for limited war, no option for fighting Russia only. The plan had its own logic, its own momentum. Once mobilization began, stopping became impossible. But mobilization didn't begin by accident. It began because people in positions of power chose to begin it. The critical moment came July 29th through 31st. Russia ordered partial mobilization to support Serbia. Germany demanded Russia stop. Russia refused. Germany demanded France declare neutrality in any Russo-German war and hand over the fortresses of Toul and Verdun as guarantee. France refused. Germany's military leadership told the Kaiser that delay meant disaster. The Schlieffen Plan required immediate execution, or it wouldn't work. Helmuth von Moltke, chief of the German General Staff, pushed hardest. He believed war was inevitable. Better now than later, when Russia's military reforms would be complete, when France's army would be stronger. This was Germany's moment, perhaps Germany's last moment. Strike now or lose the chance forever. On August 1st, Germany declared war on Russia. On August 3rd, on France. On August 4th, German troops crossed into Belgium. Belgium was neutral, guaranteed neutral by treaty. By a treaty Germany had signed. The Belgian response shocked German planners. King Albert I rejected German demands for free passage, mobilized the tiny Belgian army, ordered resistance. The fortress city of Liège, guarding the key routes into Belgium, was to hold as long as possible. Liège held for 12 days. The Belgian garrison numbered 35, 0 against 100, 0 German troops backed by the heaviest artillery ever deployed in warfare. The Germans brought up 42-centimetre howitzers, big Bertha guns that fired shells weighing nearly a ton. Each shell could demolish a concrete fortress. The sound of their firing could be heard 20 miles away. The forts around Liège fell one by one, but they took time to fall, and time was what the Schlieffen Plan couldn't afford. Every day Belgian resistance delayed the German advance was a day French armies could deploy, British forces could cross the Channel, Russian armies could mobilize. Belgium fought knowing it would lose. Fought anyway. Bought time for its allies. Demonstrated that small nations would resist great powers, that treaties meant something, that neutrality would be defended. Britain had its own treaty with Belgium, the scrap of paper, as German leadership dismissively called it, and on August 4th, Britain honoured that scrap of paper and declared war on Germany. Britain's decision wasn't automatic. The cabinet was divided. The Liberal government had pacifist elements who opposed war. The public was uncertain. Many British citizens didn't understand why a Balkan quarrel required British involvement. Some politicians argued Britain should stay neutral, let continental powers exhaust themselves. But Belgium changed the calculation. German violation of Belgian neutrality made this about international law, about whether treaties meant anything, about whether great powers could simply ignore agreements when convenient. And it raised a more practical concern. If Germany defeated France and controlled the Belgian coast, the Channel ports would become German naval bases. Britain's strategic security depended on keeping those ports out of hostile hands. Foreign Secretary Sir Edward Grey captured the moment in a famous remark. Standing at his window as dusk fell on August 3rd, he said, "The lamps are going out all over Europe. We shall not see them lit again in our lifetime." He was right. The First World War had begun, but listen carefully to what didn't cause it. No automatic alliance system made this inevitable. Russia could have backed down. Germany could have restrained Austria. Austria could have negotiated. France could have stayed neutral. Britain could have stayed out. At every single decision point, human beings made choices, and enough of them chose war. Why? That's the question historians still fight over. Some argue Germany wanted European hegemony, the Fischer thesis that exploded comfortable narratives in 1961. Some argue all powers shared equal guilt, the Clark thesis that rehabilitated the sleepwalkers narrative in 2012. Some point to imperial competition, to militarism, to nationalism, to the arms race, to Balkan instability. All of these factors mattered. None of them made war automatic. What made war happen was the belief that it would be short, decisive, home by Christmas. Every general staff in Europe had plans for 6-week victories. Nobody had plans for 4 years. The German army that invaded Belgium in August 1914 expected to be in Paris by September. The plan almost worked. Almost. 70 German divisions wheeled through Belgium, smashed the small Belgian army, scattered French forces, drove toward Paris. By early September, German troops were 30 miles from the French capital. The government fled to Bordeaux. Defeat looked certain. Then the French counterattacked at the Marne. This is the moment the 20th century actually began, not at Sarajevo, at the Marne. Because when the French line held, when the German advance stalled, when both sides realized breakthrough was impossible, they started digging. And they didn't stop digging for 4 years. Imagine you're a French soldier, September 1914. You've been retreating for weeks, now you're ordered to advance. You fix your bayonet, you charge across open ground toward German positions, and you discover what industrial warfare means. The machine gun, Hiram Maxim invented it in 1884, a single weapon that could fire 500 rounds per minute, aimed fire, sustained fire. One gun could hold an entire company at bay. The French and German armies had machine guns in August 1914. Neither fully understood what they meant. By September, they understood. Advancing infantry didn't advance anymore. They died. Hundreds of men cut down in minutes crossing ground that cavalry had crossed for centuries. The entire tactical doctrine of European armies, mass, movement, decisive battle, became suicide. So they went underground. By November 1914, the trench lines ran from Switzerland to the English Channel. 440 miles of fortified positions, barbed wire, machine gun posts, artillery emplacements, no flanks, no maneuver space, no way forward except through, and through meant dying. The race to the sea they called the final weeks before the trenches solidified. Both sides trying to outflank each other northward, trying to find open ground, trying to restore maneuver warfare. Each attempt failed. Each extension of the line created new stalemate, until they reached the ocean and ran out of room. The Belgian coast became the northern anchor. Nieuport, where the Belgians deliberately flooded the polders, opened the sluice gates and let the sea reclaim the land, creating an impassable barrier that saved what remained of independent Belgium. King Albert I held this tiny corner of his kingdom throughout the war. Belgium refused to surrender despite losing 90% of its territory. From Nieuport, the trenches snaked southeast through Ypres, pronounced wipers by British soldiers who couldn't manage Flemish pronunciation. The Ypres salient would become synonymous with futility, a bulge in the Allied line that the British held despite it being dominated by German artillery on three sides. 3 massive battles would be fought for Ypres. Hundreds of thousands would die there. The line barely moved, south through Artois and Picardy, past Arras, where the medieval city would be methodically destroyed by 4 years of shelling, past Albert with its famous Golden Virgin statue atop the basilica, hit by shell fire but never quite falling, leaning at impossible angle. Soldiers on both sides developed superstitions about it. The Virgin would fall when the war ended, some said. She didn't fall until 1918 through the Somme Valley, past Verdun, through the Argonne Forest where American soldiers would die in 1918, down through Alsace to the Swiss border, 440 miles of hell. And the trenches weren't static. They evolved, deepened, became more sophisticated. What started as hasty ditches in 1914 became elaborate underground systems by 1916. Frontline trenches were just the beginning. Behind them, support trenches. Behind those, reserve trenches. Communication trenches zigzagging back and forth, connecting the systems. Deep dugouts 30 feet underground with reinforced timbers and sometimes electric lights. Underground chambers that could hold entire companies, aid stations, command posts, ammunition stores, everything going underground because above ground meant death. The Germans generally had better trenches. They'd taken the high ground in 1914 and fortified it properly. Concrete bunkers, deep shelters, drainage systems. The German High Command had recognized earlier that this would be long war, that defensive positions needed to be livable. Allied trenches were often worse, built in low ground because that's where the German advance had stopped, constantly flooding, less developed because Allied strategy was offensive. They were supposed to break through, not settle in. So Allied soldiers often lived in worse conditions, attacking uphill against better fortified positions. No man's land varied from 50 yards to half a mile. The narrow sections were worst, close enough to hear enemy soldiers talking, close enough to throw grenades into their trenches, close enough that night raids were constant. Living under that tension, knowing the enemy was right there, never relaxing. Some sections developed live and let live arrangements, unofficial truces. Don't shell during meals, don't snipe at work parties repairing trenches, fire high during required demonstrations of aggression. These arrangements happen spontaneously, against orders, because soldiers on both sides recognize the mutual benefit of minimizing pointless death. Officers discouraged it, ordered raids specifically to break the informal truces, keep the men aggressive. Keep them seeing the enemy as enemy, can't let them become human to each other. But in the quiet sectors, the arrangements persisted. Men weren't stupid, they understood the war was going nowhere. Why die for a trench you'd taken yesterday that the enemy would retake tomorrow? Let me put you in a trench. Western Front, winter 1914. You're standing in a ditch 6 feet deep, 4 feet wide, wooden planks under your boots because otherwise you'd be standing in mud, sandbags at chest height, packed earth above. The smell hits you first, unwashed bodies, latrine buckets, decomposing rats, and underneath it all the sweet, sick smell of corpses rotting in no man's land 50 yards ahead. You're cold, always cold. The dampness gets into your bones and never leaves. Trench foot is already spreading through your unit, feet rotting inside boots from constant wetness. You've seen men whose toes have turned black and fallen off. The trenches aren't just a ditch, they're an entire underground system. Frontline trenches, support trenches, reserve trenches, all connected by communication trenches that zigzag back from the front. The zigzag pattern is intentional. If enemy soldiers break into the trench, they can't fire straight down the line. Every few yards, a traverse blocks the line of sight. You share this space with rats, millions of them. Rats the size of cats, gorged on corpses and food waste. They run across your face while you sleep, bite sleeping men, spread disease. You've learned to sleep with your mess tin over your face to keep them off. Doesn't always work. The lice are worse. Everyone has them, living in your clothes, in the seams of your uniform, breeding faster than you can kill them. The itching drives men mad. You've seen soldiers strip naked in the middle of winter, trying to burn the lice out of their clothes, knowing they'll be back within hours. The British call it chatting, sitting around picking lice from clothes and crushing them. It becomes social activity, something to do during the endless waiting. Water is everywhere and nowhere. Rain fills the trenches, turns them into canals of liquid mud. But drinking water comes up once a day in containers that often spill on the way. You're always thirsty, always wet, always cold. Food arrives at night. Canned beef, hardtack biscuits that break your teeth, tea that's cold by the time it reaches the front line. Sometimes jam. Rarely fresh bread. You eat standing in the trench, hunched over to stay below the parapet, trying to keep the rain out of your mess tin. At night, you stand watch. 2 hours staring into darkness, listening for sounds of German raiding parties. Sometimes flares go up, turning no man's land into a brief snapshot of hell, barbed wire, shell craters, bodies hanging on the wire from the last failed attack. Sometimes you hear wounded men out there, crying for help, crying for their mothers. You can't reach them. Trying means dying, so you listen to them cry until they stop. The sound changes you. First night, you want to help. Second night, you want to help but you're scared. Third night, you're just annoyed they're still making noise. Fourth night, you don't hear them anymore. You've learned to filter it out, to make the screaming background noise. This is what the war does. Takes your humanity piece by piece until you're something else, something that can sleep while men die 50 yards away, something that can eat breakfast next to a corpse and not care, something that can kill and feel nothing. During the day you sleep if you can, though the artillery, never stops. Random shelling. Harassing fire. The constant percussion that makes your ears ring and your hands shake. Shell shock, they're starting to call it. Men who've stopped being able to function, who curl up, shaking, who can't stop crying. You've seen it happen, watched men you respected, brave men, men who'd been through months of fighting, suddenly break. 1 minute they're fine, next minute they're screaming about things that aren't there, or they go quiet. Stare at nothing. Won't respond to orders, can't seem to hear you when you talk to them. Your officers shoot them for cowardice, not all of them. Some get sent to aid stations, some get diagnosed with shell shock and evacuated, but others, the ones who break during an attack, the ones who refuse to go over the top, the ones whose fear is too visible, those get executed. Pour encourager les autres. To encourage the others. You've watched it. Formation at dawn. The condemned man tied to a post. Firing squad of men from his own unit. They select people who didn't know him well. 12 rifles, some loaded with blanks, so no one knows who fired the killing shot. Officer with pistol to deliver the coup de grace if the rifles don't finish him. The worst is when the man breaks down, cries, begs, soils himself. You have to watch that. Remember it. Understand that this could be you if you show weakness. This is going to be your life now, for months, for years. The trench is rotating occupation, days in the front line, days in support trenches, days in reserve, then back to the front line. An endless cycle of boredom punctuated by moments of terror when you're ordered to go over the top. That's the phrase, over the top. Climbing out of your trench and advancing toward the German line across no man's land while they shoot at you with machine guns. You've never done this yet. You will. And you'll understand then what every attacking soldier learned in 1915. You're probably going to die. The mathematics were brutal. Defensive firepower exceeded offensive capability by orders of magnitude. A man in a trench with a rifle could kill a man advancing across open ground. A man with a machine gun could kill dozens. Artillery could kill hundreds without ever seeing them. The defensive advantage wasn't new. Military theorists had recognized it before the war. The Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905 had demonstrated what modern weapons did to attacking infantry. European military observers had watched Japanese troops suffer massive casualties attacking Russian trenches at Port Arthur. They'd written reports, noted the lessons, then ignored them. Because accepting the defensive advantage meant accepting that decisive victory was impossible. That the military doctrine of every European army, offensive à outrance, attack to the utmost, was obsolete. Generals couldn't accept this, wouldn't accept this. So they convinced themselves that superior morale, better training, and French élan, vital or German discipline, would overcome firepower. They were catastrophically wrong, but having committed to the offensive, having lost hundreds of thousands of men in failed attacks, they couldn't admit the fundamental premise was flawed. To admit that would mean all those deaths were wasted. So they looked for ways to make the offensive work. Artillery became the answer, the breakthrough tool. If infantry couldn't cross no man's land under machine gun fire, then artillery must destroy the machine guns first. Simple, logical, wrong. Artillery in 1915 was impressive. The French 75mm field gun could fire 15 rounds per minute. German heavy howitzers threw shells weighing hundreds of pounds miles behind enemy lines. British artillery parks held thousands of guns. The industrial capacity to produce shells reached millions per month. But artillery had a problem. It couldn't actually destroy trenches. It could crater the ground, destroy surface structures, cut wire sometimes, but soldiers in deep dugouts survived. Machine guns were hauled underground during bombardments and brought back up when they lifted. The defensive infrastructure was too resilient, and bombardments warned defenders that attack was coming every time. Surprise became impossible. The moment the artillery started, defenders knew infantry would follow when it stopped. They prepared, brought up reserves, concentrated machine guns, waited. Moreover, bombardments destroyed the ground the infantry had to cross, cratered it, turned it into impassable moonscape, made advance slower, harder, more exposed. The artillery that was supposed to help the infantry often made their job impossible. But generals kept believing, kept thinking the next bombardment would be heavy enough, long enough, that eventually they'd find the formula that would destroy defenses and allow breakthrough. They never found it, because it didn't exist, not until combined arms tactics, tanks, aircraft, and infiltration methods were developed in 1918. But that took 4 years and millions of deaths to learn, so the generals tried to solve the problem with artillery. If machine guns made advance impossible, destroy the machine guns with shell fire first, bombard the enemy trenches until nothing lives, then send the infantry across. Verdun was this logic taken to its extreme. February 19th, 16. The German Chief of Staff, Erich von Falkenhayn, decided that breakthrough was impossible, but attrition could work. If Germany killed enough Frenchmen, France would have to surrender. So he chose a target the French couldn't abandon, the fortress city of Verdun, and announced he would bleed France white. Verdun had symbolic weight beyond its strategic value. The fortress complex had stood for centuries, protected France's eastern frontier, represented French strength and permanence. Losing Verdun would be psychological catastrophe for France. Falkenhayn understood this. He didn't need to capture Verdun, he just needed to threaten it, force France to defend it, turn it into killing ground where German artillery superiority would destroy the French army. The bombardment began February 21st. 2 million shells in 12 hours, the heaviest artillery barrage in history to that point. German commanders believed nothing could survive it. The sound was beyond comprehension. Imagine thunder that never stops, that shakes the ground continuously, that makes your organs vibrate inside your chest. Men's ears bled from the pressure. The concussion killed men in deep bunkers without wounding them. Their organs liquefied from the shock waves. The landscape transformed into moonscape. Trees vanished, buildings disintegrated. The earth itself was churned and rechurned, the soil mixed with shrapnel and body parts until ground, and corpses became indistinguishable. Shell craters overlapped, creating a sea of broken ground where nothing lived, nothing grew, nothing remained but mud and metal. French soldiers survived it. They survived in deep bunkers, in cellars, in shell holes, and when German infantry advanced, the survivors emerged and killed them. The battle became mutual attrition, both sides feeding divisions into a meat grinder, measuring progress in yards, counting success in casualty ratios. The German infantry came in massed formations, expecting to walk over destroyed defenses. Instead, they found French machine gunners who'd sheltered deep, who emerged as the barrage lifted, who set up their weapons in the shell craters and waited. The Germans died in the same massed formations that would destroy British soldiers at the Somme months later. The lesson was learned and forgotten, and learned again, battle after battle. Fort Douaumont fell on February 25th. The Germans celebrated. The fort was Verdun's keystone, the most powerful fortification in the complex. Its capture should have broken French resistance. Instead, French command ordered, "They shall not pass, no retreat." Verdun holds. Philippe Pétain took command of Verdun's defense, organized the Sacred Way, the supply road that kept the battle fed, instituted rotation system. Divisions spent limited time at Verdun before being pulled out and replaced. This prevented complete breakdown but meant more of the French army experienced Verdun's hell. The battle became legendary for its horror. Men went mad from the endless bombardment. Shell shock became epidemic. Soldiers reported seeing phantoms in the smoke, hearing voices, losing all sense of time and space. Some walked calmly into machine gun fire, seeking death as release. Water was scarce. Food was irregular. Sleep was impossible. The dead were everywhere, lining trenches, filling shell holes, hanging on wire. No time to bury them, no place to bury them, even if time existed. So they became part of the landscape. Soldiers used corpses as sandbags, took shelter behind piles of dead men, walked on the dead to avoid the mud. At night, the screaming from no man's land was constant. Wounded men in German and French crying for help that wouldn't come. Some took days to die. You could track their fading overnights. Night 1, loud screaming. Night 2, weak crying. Night 3, occasional moans. Night 4, silence. The psychological damage was permanent. Men who survived Verdun were never the same. They'd seen the maximum of what industrial war could do to human beings. They'd lived through it. Many wished they hadn't. The Battle of Verdun lasted 10 months. 700,000 casualties combined. French and German soldiers fighting over the same destroyed villages, the same shell-cratered hills, the same muddy wastes month after month. At peak intensity, the French were losing 5,000 men per day. They rotated units through Verdun on the Sacred Way, the supply road that kept the battle fed with fresh troops and ammunition. 75% of the French army served at Verdun at some point. It became a symbol. They shall not pass. The moment France proved it couldn't be broken, but the cost was enormous. France lost 378,000 casualties at Verdun. Dead, wounded, missing, captured, an entire generation. And while Verdun ground on, the British prepared their own offensive at the Somme, July 1st, 1916. Remember this date. This is the day the world changed. The plan was simple. 7 days of artillery bombardment, 1.7 million shells fired at German positions, then British infantry would advance across no man's land and occupy the destroyed German trenches. Breakthrough was expected by noon. British Commander Douglas Haig believed in the plan completely. The artillery would cut the wire, destroy the German trenches, kill the defenders. All the infantry had to do was walk across and occupy the position. Simple, inevitable. The math was overwhelming. 7 million shells against German trenches. Nothing could survive that. The artillery bombardment was visible from England. People in Kent reported seeing flashes on the horizon, hearing the distant rumble. The guns fired continuously for 7 days. German soldiers in the bunkers went mad from it. Some killed themselves rather than endure another hour. Others sat catatonic, unable to respond to commands. The bombardment was designed to be total, to make survival impossible, but many British shells were defective, didn't explode, buried themselves in the mud. Others exploded but couldn't penetrate the deep German bunkers, concrete reinforced shelters 30 feet underground. The wire-cutting shells often failed to cut wire, just tangled it worse, and the Germans knew the attack was coming. 7 days of bombardment removed all surprise. They knew when it would lift, knew what would follow, prepared accordingly. At 7:28 a.m. on July 1st, the bombardment lifted. 2 minutes later, at 7:30, whistles blew along the British line. 100,000 British soldiers climbed out of their trenches and began walking toward the German line. Walking, not running, loaded with 66 pounds of equipment each. Walking in parade ground lines because their officers believed the artillery had destroyed German defences. The British soldiers were volunteers, the New Army they were called. Men who'd enlisted in 1914 and 1915, motivated by patriotism, adventure, propaganda. PALS battalions, entire units recruited from single towns, single workplaces, single communities. Birmingham factory workers in one battalion, Liverpool dock workers in another, Leeds shop clerks in a third. This created unit cohesion, also created concentrated tragedy. When a PALS battalion was destroyed, entire communities lost their young men in a single day. It hadn't. Deep German bunkers had protected machine gun crews from the bombardment. When the shelling stopped, they hauled their guns up to firing positions and waited. Imagine being a German machine gunner that morning. You've endured 7 days of bombardment, convinced you're about to die. The shelling finally stops. Silence. You emerge from your bunker, climb to your position, set up your machine gun, look out across no man's land, and see lines of British soldiers walking toward you. Parade ground formations, shoulder to shoulder, perfect targets, so many you can't miss. Don't have to aim carefully, just traverse the gun back and forth. The bullets will find targets. Some German gunners reported feeling sick. This wasn't combat, this was slaughter. They were killing men who couldn't effectively fight back, but they kept firing. Because those British soldiers were coming to kill them, because stopping meant losing, because this is what war was now. The British came on in waves, perfect targets, parade ground formations advancing across open ground at walking pace. The German machine gunners opened fire. What happened next wasn't battle, it was industrial slaughter. British soldiers fell in rows. Entire companies wiped out in minutes. Those who reached the German wire, much of it uncut by the bombardment, became trapped targets. Those who tried to retreat were shot from behind by their own officers enforcing the order to advance. Some units made it to German trenches, fought hand-to-hand, died there. A few captured German positions and held them through the day, waiting for reinforcements that never came because everything behind them had been destroyed. Some officers realized the situation within minutes and tried to stop the advance, were overruled by commanders miles behind the lines who couldn't see what was happening. Communication broke down, telephone lines were cut by shell fire, runners were killed crossing no man's land. So the attacks continued, wave after wave, into the same machine gun fire, dying in the same places. By noon, 19,240 British soldiers were dead, 38,000 more were wounded. The British Army had suffered 57,470 casualties in a single day. The worst day in British military history, by far. And the battle continued for 4 more months. Haig didn't stop, couldn't stop. To stop meant admitting the first day was wasted, that those 57 Belgian casualties bought nothing. So the offensive continued. Smaller attacks, different tactics. Tanks were introduced in September, the first use of armoured vehicles in warfare. They broke down, got stuck in mud, were destroyed by artillery. But they pointed to the future. The village of Pozières was fought over for weeks, captured and recaptured. British, Australian and German soldiers dying for a piece of ground that had no strategic value beyond being the current objective. One Australian battalion went into Pozières 900 strong, came out with 180 survivors after 10 days. Beaumont Hamel was attacked repeatedly. The Newfoundland Regiment assaulted it on July 1st, advanced 700 men, lost 684 in half an hour. The regiment effectively ceased to exist, an entire generation of young Newfoundlanders dead in 30 minutes. The Somme became the symbol of World War I's horror. The proof that the war had become something beyond human scale. Industrial civilization turned against itself, factories producing shells instead of goods. Science developing better ways to kill. Entire economies mobilized for destruction. And the worst part? The Somme didn't change anything. The front line barely moved. No breakthrough occurred. Both sides claimed victory based on casualty counts. Germany, because they killed more British than Britain killed Germans. Britain, because they killed more Germans than they expected. Victory measured in corpses, progress measured in yards. This is what total war meant, not victory, not defeat, just continuation, just endurance, just surviving until the other side couldn't. Total war was industrial war, was economic war, was societal war. Everything mobilized, everyone involved. The entire nation weaponized for conflict. Britain introduced conscription in 1916, unprecedented for a nation that had always relied on volunteers. Every able-bodied man between 18 and 41 could be called up. Conscientious objectors were imprisoned. The war consumed manpower like coal-fed furnaces. The munitions industry transformed. British shell production in 1914, 70, 0 shells per month. By 1916, 6 million per month. This required complete reorganization of British industry. Factories converted from civilian to military production. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. Munitionettes, they were called. Working with high explosives, toxic chemicals, dangerous machinery. Hundreds died in factory accidents. Thousands more suffered poisoning from TNT exposure. Their skin turned yellow. They were called canary girls. The same pattern repeated across Europe. German chemical industry shifted from dyes to explosives. French factories that made textiles made uniforms. Russian industry, inadequate before the war, completely collapsed under the strain. Italian industry barely functioned. Austria-Hungary's industry served only German needs. By 1916, the home front became battlefront, not from combat, but from deprivation, food shortages, rationing, substitute materials, coffee made from acorns, bread from sawdust. Germany suffered worst from British naval blockade. By 1917, Germans were starving. Turnip winter, they called 1916-1917, when turnips became primary food source. Malnutrition became epidemic. Disease followed. Civilians died from hunger while their government insisted the war continue. Children worked in factories. The elderly worked in fields. Anyone who could contribute did. Those who couldn't were burdens. The disabled, the sick, the very young and very old, they suffered most when resources became scarce. Inflation destabilized economies. War bonds financed initial mobilization but couldn't sustain 4 years of spending. Governments printed money, prices rose. Workers demanded higher wages. Governments imposed wage controls. Black markets flourished. Social cohesion frayed. Strikes became common in 1917 in Germany, in France, in Britain. Workers weren't protesting the war necessarily, they were protesting conditions. But the effect was the same. Production disrupted, military supplies delayed. Governments responded with force, arrested strike leaders, broke unions, deployed troops against their own citizens. This was total war's reality. Everyone suffered, everyone sacrificed, everyone endured. The question was who would break first. By 1917, all sides were breaking. Russia broke first. The Tsar's army had suffered catastrophic defeats in 1915, millions dead, entire divisions destroyed, and the home front was collapsing. Food shortages, inflation, strikes. The Russian collapse had been building for years. The empire's industrial base couldn't support modern war. Rifle production couldn't keep up with losses. Artillery shell production was wholly inadequate. Russian soldiers were sent into battle without weapons, told to pick up rifles from dead comrades. The transportation system was failing. Russia's vast distances became fatal weakness. Railways couldn't move enough supplies to the front and enough food to the cities. Commanders had to choose, feed the army or feed the population. They chose the army. Cities starved. In Petrograd, bread lines grew longer each week. Women stood for hours in freezing weather waiting for bread that often ran out before they reached the front of the line. Workers' wages couldn't keep up with inflation. The price of food doubled, tripled, quadrupled. Strikes broke out in factories, police suppressed them, the cycle repeated. The Tsar's government was incompetent and corrupt. Nicholas II had taken personal command of the army in 1915, leaving the government in the hands of his wife Alexandra and her advisor Rasputin. Alexandra was German by birth. Rumors spread that she was German spy. Rasputin was mystic and charlatan. Rumors spread that he controlled the government through sexual manipulation. Most rumors were false, but they were believed. The monarchy's legitimacy collapsed. Aristocrats joked about assassinating the Tsar, generals discussed coup, workers talked about revolution. In March 1917, workers in Petrograd rioted. Troops ordered to suppress them mutinied. Within days, Tsar Nicholas II had abdicated. The 300-year-old Romanov dynasty ended. The February Revolution, called that because Russia still used the old Julian calendar, happened with shocking speed. One week Nicholas was Tsar, next week he was prisoner. The empire that had defeated Napoleon, that sprawled across 11 time zones, that fielded the largest army in the world, it collapsed in days. A provisional government took power, made one critical decision: continue the war. Russia's allies in Britain and France pressured them to stay in the fight, promised support. The Eastern Front tied down German divisions that would otherwise reinforce the West. Russia had to keep fighting. The provisional government believed in the war, believed in defending Russia, believed in honoring commitments to allies. They were liberals, constitutionalists, patriots. They would create new democratic Russia, and new Russia would fight more effectively because soldiers would fight for freedom rather than tyranny. Russian soldiers disagreed. They were dying for a government that couldn't feed them, in a war they didn't understand, for objectives nobody could explain. Desertion became epidemic. Entire units abandoned the front, walked home. The army's discipline disintegrated. Soldiers elected councils, Soviets, that debated orders before following them. Officers who'd abused soldiers were beaten or killed. The army was becoming revolutionary mob. Alexander Kerensky, the provisional government's leader, tried one last offensive in June 1917. The Kerensky Offensive: prove Russia could still fight, restore morale, show the Allies Russia was committed. It failed catastrophically. German counterattack shattered Russian lines. Soldiers fled, units disintegrated. The offensive proved Russia's army was finished as fighting force. Into this chaos stepped Vladimir Lenin. Lenin had returned to Russia in April 1917, traveling from Swiss exile through Germany in sealed train. The Germans facilitated his return, hoping he would undermine the Russian war effort. They succeeded beyond their expectations. The sealed train journey was one of history's strangest diplomatic maneuvers. German High Command identified Lenin as weapon they could deploy against Russia. They negotiated his passage through Germany with explicit understanding that he would never leave the train on German soil. Lenin, 32 Bolsheviks and various other Russian exiles traveled in sealed railway cars from Switzerland through Germany to Sweden, then to Russia. Germany's investment, the equivalent of several $1 million in support for Bolshevik activities. Germany's return, Russia's exit from the war. Lenin's message was simple: peace, land, bread, end the war, give land to peasants, feed the cities. The Bolshevik Party offered clear program when everyone else offered continued suffering. But Lenin was political genius, playing long game. He understood that the provisional government's fatal weakness was continuing the war. Every day the war continued. The government lost legitimacy. Every failed offensive proved they couldn't deliver victory. Every food shortage proved they couldn't feed the cities. Every desertion proved the army was disintegrating. So Lenin waited. Let the provisional government exhaust itself. Let Kerensky's June offensive fail catastrophically. Let food shortages worsen. Let workers strike. Let soldiers desert. Let the chaos build. The Bolsheviks weren't popular in April. They were minority party, radical, Marxist. Most Russians wanted moderate reform, not communist revolution, but Lenin understood that in crisis, clarity matters more than popularity. The provisional government offered complexity, conditions, eventual reform. Lenin offered simple solutions now. Through summer 1917, Bolshevik support grew, not because Russians became communist, because Russians wanted the war to end, and only the Bolsheviks promised immediate peace. Wanted land reform, and only the Bolsheviks promised immediate redistribution. Wanted food, and only the Bolsheviks blamed the right enemies, the bourgeoisie, the landowners, the capitalists who profited from suffering. The July days nearly derailed everything. Spontaneous uprising in Petrograd. Workers and soldiers took to the streets demanding the Soviets seize power. Lenin hadn't planned it, wasn't ready. The provisional government suppressed the uprising, arrested Bolshevik leaders. Lenin fled to Finland. The government thought they'd won, they hadn't. They'd shown they could suppress revolt but couldn't address underlying problems. The war continued. Food shortages continued. Nothing improved. Then in August came the Kornilov affair. General Lava Kornilov, appointed supreme commander by Kerensky, marched troops toward Petrograd supposedly to crush the Bolsheviks. Kerensky panicked, thinking Kornilov planned military coup, armed the Bolsheviks to defend Petrograd, gave them weapons, legitimacy, organization. Kornilov's coup failed. His troops refused to attack Petrograd, but the damage was done. The provisional government had armed the Bolsheviks, had demonstrated its own weakness, had proven it feared the right more than the left. By October, conditions were perfect for revolution. The provisional government commanded no loyalty. The army was disintegrating. The food situation was desperate. And the Bolsheviks were organized, armed, and ready. In November 1917, Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks seized power. Their first act was suing for peace. The October Revolution, again old calendar, was almost bloodless. Bolshevik soldiers and Red Guards occupied key points in Petrograd, surrounded the Winter Palace where the provisional government met. The government surrendered. Lenin declared Soviet power. Most Russians didn't understand what had happened, didn't know who the Bolsheviks were, didn't grasp that this was communist revolution. They just knew the war might end. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, signed March 1918, took Russia out of the war. The price was enormous. Russia lost Poland, the Baltic states, Ukraine, Finland, 1/3 of its population, 1/4 of its territory. The Brest-Litovsk negotiations revealed the total power imbalance. Germany dictated terms, Russia accepted them. Lenin argued that peace at any price was necessary. The Bolsheviks needed time to consolidate power, to survive, to build socialism. Giving up territory was temporary. The coming world revolution would redraw all borders anyway. Trotsky, Lenin's negotiator, tried to stall, declared no war, no peace. Russia would neither fight nor sign treaty. Germany responded by advancing further into Russia. Bolsheviks capitulated and signed. Germany had won in the east, and now could turn everything west. The German spring offensive of 1918 was the last gamble. Transfer divisions from the Eastern Front, develop new stormtrooper tactics, small units with automatic weapons, bypassing strongpoints, infiltrating deep. Break the Allied line before American reinforcements arrived in strength. The stormtrooper tactics represented genuine innovation. Rather than mass assaults, small teams of elite troops equipped with light machine guns, grenades, and flamethrowers would infiltrate enemy lines. Avoid strongpoints, push deep into rear areas, cause chaos, let follow-up forces destroy isolated positions. The tactics worked. German soldiers trained specifically for this role. Young, fit, motivated, equipped with the best weapons. They would be the spearhead that broke 3 years of stalemate. Because America had entered the war. April 6, 1917. President Woodrow Wilson asked Congress for a declaration of war against Germany. The vote was overwhelming. America was coming. Wilson had tried to stay neutral. had campaigned for re-election in 1916 on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." American public opinion was divided. Irish Americans opposed supporting Britain. German Americans opposed fighting Germany. Progressives saw the war as imperialist slaughter. Businessmen profited from selling to both sides. Why join? But German submarine warfare made neutrality impossible. U-boats were sinking American ships, killing American civilians. The Lusitania sinking in 1915 had shocked Americans. A passenger liner torpedoed. 198 dead, including 128 Americans. Germany had stopped unrestricted submarine warfare after American protests, then restarted it in 1917, calculating they could starve Britain into submission before America could mobilize. The calculation included British starvation timeline. German Naval Command estimated Britain had food reserves for 3 to 4 months at current consumption. Unrestricted submarine warfare would sink 600,000 tons of shipping per month. Britain would starve by August, would have to surrender. America couldn't mobilize, train, and deploy an army in that time. The math worked, except the math missed 2 things. First, British food reserves were larger than German intelligence estimated. Second, convoy system worked. Once Britain started grouping merchant ships in escorted convoys instead of sailing independently, submarine effectiveness dropped dramatically. The same destroyers that couldn't patrol vast ocean could protect concentrated convoys. U-boats trying to attack convoys were detected and destroyed. Shipping losses declined. Britain didn't starve. Then came the Zimmermann telegram. German Foreign Secretary Arthur Zimmermann sent coded message to German ambassador in Mexico. If America enters the war, offer alliance to Mexico. Promise American territory, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, if Mexico joins Germany. British intelligence intercepted and decoded the telegram, gave it to Wilson. Wilson released it publicly. American outrage was instant and universal. Germany was plotting to give American territory to Mexico. Even previously, neutral Americans saw this as unacceptable. Wilson had his justification. On April 2nd, Wilson addressed Congress. "The world must be made safe for democracy," he said. America would fight not for territory or conquest, but for principle, for international law, for democracy against autocracy, to end all wars. The vote was overwhelming but not unanimous. Senator Robert La Follette of Wisconsin and others opposed, arguing Wilson was leading America into unnecessary slaughter. They were shouted down. The war fever had taken hold, but voting for war was easy. Building an army was hard. The calculation was wrong. America declared war, but America needed time. Time to build an army, time to train it, time to ship it to France. The United States Army in April 1917 numbered 127,588 men, smaller than Serbia's army, smaller than Belgium's. America was economic giant and military minnow. The National Defense Act of 1916 had authorized expansion to 175,000 regulars and 450 National Guardsmen, still inadequate for European-scale warfare. Conscription was necessary. The Selective Service Act passed in May required all men aged 21 to 30 to register, eventually expanded to 18 to 45. By war's end, 24 million men registered. 8 million were drafted. Combined with volunteers, America mobilized 7 million military personnel. But conscripts needed training, needed equipment, needed officers. The expansion was chaotic. Training camps were built from scratch. Equipment was scarce. American troops trained with wooden rifles, British and French weapons, anything available. Many American divisions arrived in France with no American equipment at all. They used French artillery, French aircraft, French tanks. America produced soldiers, Allies provided weapons. Training took months. A 1917 recruit might not reach France until 1918, might not be combat ready until summer 1918. This was the timeline Germany was racing against. Win before the Americans arrive in force or lose the numerical war of attrition. Germany needed victory before American divisions made Allied superiority overwhelming. The offensive began March 21st, 1918. Operation Michael. 47 German divisions attacked 26 British divisions on a 50-mile front. The assault used new tactics: brief artillery bombardment, poison gas, stormtroopers advancing in fog. The weather cooperated. Thick fog covered the battlefield. German troops advanced invisible to British defenders. By the time the fog lifted, stormtroopers were behind British lines, spreading chaos, cutting communications, destroying headquarters units. It worked. The British line broke. For the first time since 1914, open warfare returned to the Western Front. German troops advanced 40 miles. Paris came under artillery fire from German guns. Panic spread through Allied governments. The Paris gun, a massive artillery piece with a 92-mile range, began shelling Paris on March 23rd. The shells fell without warning from a weapon so far away, Parisians initially thought they were being bombed by high-altitude aircraft. The gun fired 183 shells at Paris over 140 days, killed 250 people, caused terror far beyond the casualties. Paris, the City of Light, was under direct attack for the first time since 1871. French government considered evacuating Paris again. British considered evacuating the Channel ports. The German advance seemed unstoppable, but the advance stalled. German troops outran their supplies. Allied reinforcements plugged gaps, and the offensive had cost Germany casualties it couldn't replace. The stormtroopers were irreplaceable. Elite troops trained for months, experienced and motivated. They took the highest casualties because they led every attack. Each offensive burned through thousands of Germany's best soldiers. The follow-up troops were older, less trained, less capable. German offensive power was consuming itself. Moreover, the advancing German soldiers discovered something demoralizing: Allied supply depots. After years of shortages, German troops found British and French warehouses full of food, equipment, supplies. The naval blockade was starving Germany while the Allies had abundance. Some German units stopped advancing to loot. Others realized they were losing the larger war even as they won battles. 4 more offensives followed through July. All made gains. None achieved breakthrough, and each one bled Germany's army of experienced soldiers it desperately needed for defense. Operation Georgette in April targeted the Channel ports. Operation Blücher York in May reached the Marne again. Operation Gneisenau in June tried to widen the Marne salient. Operation Marneschutz-Reims in July was the final attempt. All failed to break through. All cost irreplaceable casualties. In August, the Allies counterattacked. The 100 Days Offensive began August 8, 1918. Ludendorff called it the Black Day of the German Army. British, French, Canadian, and Australian forces broke through German lines using massed tanks, aircraft, and coordinated infantry. This wasn't trench warfare anymore. This was mobile warfare. The Allies had learned, developed combined arms tactics, integrated new weapons into doctrine that worked. Tanks led the attack, over 400 of them at Amiens. Not the unreliable machines of 1916, but improved models that worked. Behind the tanks came infantry, trained in infiltration tactics. The Allies had learned from German stormtroopers. Aircraft provided reconnaissance and ground attack. Artillery used predicted fire, mathematical calculation of trajectories rather than ranging shots that warned defenders. The attack achieved complete surprise, no preliminary bombardment. The tanks and infantry emerged from morning fog. German positions were overrun before they could respond effectively. The advance covered 7 miles in some sectors, unheard of on the Western Front. And American divisions were arriving, 250,000 per month by summer 1918. Fresh troops, full-strength divisions, endless reinforcements. The American soldiers were inexperienced. Green troops who didn't understand trench warfare. Some American commanders insisted on using outdated tactics, massed assaults in open formations. American casualties were often higher than necessary, but they kept coming. Germany was scraping the bottom of manpower barrel, conscripting teenagers and middle-aged men. America was deploying millions of fresh troops. The math was overwhelming. Germany couldn't match it. The spring offensive had shattered its army's offensive power. Now it couldn't defend either. The German line collapsed in sections through September and October. Allied forces advanced daily. German commanders reported their divisions disintegrating, soldiers surrendering en masse, mutinies spreading. At home, Germany was falling apart. Naval mutiny at Kiel, revolution in Munich, socialist uprising in Berlin. The naval mutiny was sparked by one final, futile order. German admirals planned a last battle with the British Grand Fleet, a death ride to salvage the Navy's honour. The sailors refused. They'd survived 4 years of war. They weren't dying in the last weeks for honour. The mutiny spread from ship to ship, port to port, became general revolt. The Kiel sailors formed councils. Soviets, like the Russians, demanded peace, demanded the Kaiser's abdication. Sparked revolutions across Germany. Workers' and soldiers' councils seized power in city after city. On November 9th, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated and fled to the Netherlands. 2 days earlier, a German delegation had crossed the lines to negotiate armistice. They met Allied commanders in a railway carriage in Compiègne Forest. The terms were harsh. Germany would evacuate all occupied territory, surrender massive quantities of weapons. Allied forces would occupy the Rhineland. The naval blockade would continue. Germany had no choice. The army was disintegrating. The home front was in revolution. Continuing meant total collapse. On November 11th, at 5 a.m., German representatives signed the armistice in a railway carriage in Compiègne Forest. Fighting would stop at 11 a.m., the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. Except it didn't stop everywhere. Some commanders ordered final attacks. Some artillery kept firing. Some soldiers died at 10:59 a.m., 1 minute before the armistice took effect. The last British soldier killed was George Edwin Ellison, shot at 9:30 a.m. The last French soldier was Augustin Trébuchon, killed at 10:45 a.m., carrying message that soup would be served after the armistice. The last American was Henry Gunther, killed at 10:59 a.m., charging a German machine gun position whose crew was trying to wave him away. Why did they die? Some commanders wanted their units to hold honourable positions when the war ended. Some wanted to capture one more objective. Some simply hadn't updated their orders. Some soldiers didn't believe the war was ending and fought on. Approximately 11,000 casualties occurred on November 11, 1918. The final day of the war that had already killed millions. At 11 a.m., the guns fell silent. After 4 years, after 3 months, after 14 days, the Great War was over. Count the cost. 9 to 10 million military deaths. Conservative estimate, 6 to 13 million civilian deaths from violence, disease, starvation, 21 million wounded, 8 million missing or prisoners. The numbers are so large they lose meaning. Let me make them real. Every day of World War I, on average, 646 soldiers died. Every day for 565 days. More than the population of a small town, wiped out daily for over 4 years. The Battle of the Somme alone killed more British soldiers than the entire Vietnam War killed Americans. In 4 months. One battle, 4 months, more dead than a decade-long war half a century later. France lost more soldiers in World War I than America lost in all its wars combined. Revolutionary War, Civil War, both World Wars, Korea, Vietnam, everything. France, with a population of 40 million, lost 4 million soldiers. America, with a population of 100 million, lost 116, 1000. The Western Front devoured entire armies and kept fighting. The Eastern Front was worse, less mechanized, more fluid, even deadlier. The Italian front ground through 12 battles of the Isonzo River, gaining almost nothing at cost of hundreds of thousands. The Gallipoli campaign killed 140 ignorant Allied soldiers and 90,000 Ottoman soldiers attempting to knock Turkey out of the war. It failed completely. Naval battles were rare but massive. Jutland, the largest naval engagement, saw 250 ships and 100,000 men clash in 1916. Britain lost more ships. Germany claimed victory. But Germany's fleet never challenged the Royal Navy again. Strategic British victory. Tactical German success. 600 men dead in a single afternoon. Submarine warfare killed differently. Merchant sailors drowned when U-boats torpedoed their ships. No warning, no rescue. Ships sank in minutes. Crew died in freezing water. Over 15 hours and Allied merchant seamen died this way. Their deaths weren't glorious, weren't even military. They were civilians delivering food who drowned because war made everything a target. The Spanish flu pandemic of 1918-1919 killed more people than the war, estimated 50 to 100 million worldwide. But the war created conditions for the pandemic. Troop movements spread the virus, malnutrition weakened immune systems, overcrowding in military camps and hospitals became transmission vectors. Young, healthy adults died disproportionately, their strong immune systems overreacted, the cytokine storm killing them. The same age group most likely to be soldiers. Germany's death toll from the blockade is uncertain. Estimates range from 400,000 to 750,000 civilian deaths from starvation and malnutrition-related disease. The blockade continued after the armistice, maintained until Germany signed the Versailles Treaty. Children starved so adults would sign. This was policy. This was deliberate. Armenian genocide occurred during the war. Ottoman Empire, fearing Armenian collaboration with Russia, deported Armenian population from eastern provinces. The deportations became death marches, systematic killing, concentration camps, estimated 800 to 1. 5 million Armenians died. The war provided cover. International attention was elsewhere. Turkey denies it was genocide to this day. The numbers are so large they lose meaning. Try this instead. France lost 1.4 million men, 27% of men aged 18 to 27, dead. An entire generation. Britain lost 880,000. The colonies lost another 200,000. Australia, Canada, India, New Zealand, South Africa, all bled for Britain's war. Germany lost 2 million. Russia lost 1.8 million, though numbers become uncertain after the revolution. Austria-Hungary lost 1.2 million. The empire itself lost more. It ceased to exist. The Ottoman Empire lost 800,000. It ceased to exist too. 4 empires entered the war. 4 empires fell. German, Austro-Hungarian, Russian, Ottoman, all swept away, replaced by republics, by nation-states, by revolution. And in Paris, the victors gathered to decide what came next. The Paris Peace Conference opened January 1919, 69 days after the armistice. Representatives from 32 countries attended. 4 men controlled everything. Woodrow Wilson of the United States. Idealist. Believed the war could create lasting peace through international law and democracy. Georges Clemenceau of France. Realist. Wanted Germany destroyed so thoroughly it could never threaten France again. David Lloyd George of Britain. Pragmatist. Wanted Germany punished but not obliterated, fearing Soviet Russia more than a weakened Germany. Vittorio Orlando of Italy. Opportunist. Wanted territory promised by secret treaties. They negotiated for 6 months, created the Treaty of Versailles, and guaranteed the next war. The conference was circus and tragedy, delegations from every country seeking recognition, new nations demanding borders, colonial subjects demanding independence, ethnic groups demanding self-determination. Wilson's 14 points had promised new world order based on democracy and national sovereignty. Everyone interpreted this as supporting their claims. Paris in January 1919 was chaos. Hotels overflowed with delegates, petitioners, journalists, spies, opportunists. Every ethnic group wanted statehood. Every nation wanted territory. Every claim was presented as just, necessary, historically validated. Poles demanded access to sea, Czechs demanded Sudetenland, Serbs demanded Dalmatia, Romanians demanded Transylvania, Greeks demanded Smyrna, Japanese demanded Shandong. Everyone demanded something. The Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, where the treaty would be signed, was the same hall where Germany had proclaimed its empire in 1871 after defeating France. Clemenceau chose the location deliberately. Symbolism mattered. This would be France's revenge, signed in the room of France's humiliation. Wilson arrived in Europe to unprecedented adulation. Millions lined streets in Paris, London, Rome to see him. They believed he would create just peace, would apply his 14 points fairly, would build new world. Their faith would be crushed. The Big Four met in secret, made decisions behind closed doors, drew borders on maps without consulting populations involved, created countries, destroyed countries, moved millions of people without asking them. The Council of Four, Wilson, Clemenceau, Lloyd George, and Orlando met in Clemenceau's office in the French Foreign Ministry. No formal minutes were kept initially, no staff present, just four men redrawing the world. Later, as the enormity of decisions being made became apparent, note-takers were added. But the essential pattern remained. The Big Four decided, everyone else obeyed. Smaller nations discovered they had no voice. When Italian demands conflicted with Wilson's principles, Wilson threatened to leave the conference. Italy backed down, except Orlando did walk out at one point in protest, only to slink back when he realized Italy would get nothing if absent. Japan threatened to leave over the racial equality clause. Wilson placated them with Shandong. China protested. They'd been on the winning side. Why was Chinese territory given to Japan? They were ignored. The principle of self-determination applied selectively for European nations carved from Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires, yes. For German territories, no. For colonial subjects of Allied empires, absolutely not. Wilson's idealism stopped at the colour line. Democracy for white Europeans, continued imperialism for everyone else. New nations emerged from the conference. Poland, reconstituted after 123 years of non-existence. Czechoslovakia, combining Czechs and Slovaks into state that would last 70 years. Yugoslavia, uniting South Slavs under Serbian monarchy. Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, independent from collapsed Russian Empire. Austria and Hungary, separated, reduced to small nation-states. All these borders created problems. Every new nation contained ethnic minorities who didn't want to be there. Czechoslovakia had 3 million Germans. Poland had millions of Ukrainians. Yugoslavia combined Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, who shared language but little else. These borders guaranteed future conflict. Germany wasn't invited to negotiate, wasn't consulted, was presented with treaty as fait accompli, sign or face invasion. The German delegation arrived in Paris in May, were housed in hotels surrounded by barbed wire, were not allowed to attend sessions, to present arguments, to negotiate. They submitted written objections to the draft treaty. The objections were dismissed. Take it or leave it. The German foreign minister, Count Brockdorff-Rantzau, was shown the terms on May 7th. He read them, turned pale, called them unacceptable. This was diktat, not negotiation. This was Victor's justice, not Wilson's just peace. He was right. But Germany had no leverage. The army was disintegrating. The navy was interned. The blockade continued. Germans were still starving. Revolution threatened if the war continued. Germany had no choice. Here's what Versailles did to Germany. Stripped it of 13% of European territory. all colonies. Alsace-Lorraine returned to France. Polish corridor cut East Prussia off from the rest of Germany. Rhineland demilitarized. Army limited to 100,000 men. No air force, no tanks, no submarines. The territorial losses were calculated to hurt. Alsace-Lorraine had iron and coal, industrial heartland. The Polish corridor separated East Prussia from the rest of Germany, geographic absurdity that guaranteed future conflict. The Saar was placed under League of Nations control for 15 years, more coal and industry lost. Danzig became free city, major port lost. Germany's colonies were distributed among the victors as League of Nations mandates. German Southwest Africa to South Africa, German East Africa to Britain, German Pacific Islands to Japan, Australia, New Zealand. Not called colonies, that would violate Wilson's principles, but they were colonies. And Article 231, the War Guilt Clause. Germany and its allies accepted responsibility for causing all loss and damage of the war. This wasn't just moral judgment, it was legal foundation for reparations. Germany would pay for the war, all of it. The Reparations Commission eventually set the figure at 132 billion gold marks, payable over decades, an economic burden designed to cripple German recovery. The amount was astronomical. Germany's annual GDP was approximately 40 billion marks. The reparations were 3 times Germany's total economic output. How could any nation pay that? The Allies argued Germany should pay because Germany caused the war. Germany argued the amount was impossible, designed to prevent German recovery. Both were right, but the real damage was psychological. Germans didn't believe they'd lost. The army hadn't been defeated in the field. It withdrew to prepared positions, conducted fighting retreat, maintained cohesion. The armistice came while German troops still occupied French and Belgian territory. Then the Treaty of Versailles declared Germany guilty, solely responsible, criminal. The stab-in-the-back myth emerged immediately. Germany's army was undefeated. Germany was betrayed by socialists, by communists, by Jews, by the November criminals who signed the armistice. This lie poisoned German politics for a generation, made democratic government impossible, created the conditions for Hitler's rise, and the Allies knew it might happen. John Maynard Keynes, British economist at the conference, resigned in protest, published a book warning that Versailles would lead to disaster, that the reparations were unworkable, that German resentment would explode. Keynes argued in The Economic Consequences of the Peace that reparations would impoverish Germany, destabilize Europe's economy, create resentment that would lead to future war. He was ignored. The book became bestseller, but changed nothing. He was right. But understand something, Clemenceau wasn't wrong either. France had been invaded twice by Germany in 50 years, in 1870 and 1914. 2 million French casualties in the recent war, northern France devastated. Why should France trust Germany? Why should France show mercy? Clemenceau had seen Prussian troops occupy Paris in 1871, was alive when Bismarck dictated peace in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, had watched France humiliated, Alsace-Lorraine annexed, massive indemnity imposed. That treaty created French desire for revenge. That revenge had shaped French policy for 40 years. Now France had won. Why shouldn't France impose the same terms Germany had imposed in 1871? Why shouldn't France ensure Germany could never threaten France again? The tragedy of Versailles is that everyone had legitimate grievances and nobody could reconcile them. Wilson wanted justice, Clemenceau wanted security, Germany wanted dignity. All were incompatible. So they created a peace that satisfied nobody and guaranteed future conflict. The League of Nations was supposed to prevent this. Wilson's great project, international organization, collective security, arbitration instead of war. Wilson believed the League would correct Versailles' injustices over time. That international cooperation would solve problems the peace conference couldn't. That humanity had learned from the war and would embrace new way. The United States Senate refused to join. Wilson's own country rejected his vision. Isolationists argued the League would drag America into European conflicts. Nationalists rejected international authority over American decisions. The Senate voted down the Treaty of Versailles and League membership. Wilson was broken man, suffered stroke, spent his final years watching his vision collapse. Without America, the League had no enforcement power, no ability to prevent aggression. It became a talking shop, failed every major test, Manchuria, Ethiopia, the Rhineland. By 1939, the League of Nations was irrelevant and the world was at war again. World War II wasn't a separate conflict. It was World War I's continuation after a 20-year armistice. Hitler's entire political program came from Versailles: grievances, restore German honor, reclaim lost territory, reunite ethnic Germans, destroy the November criminals, revenge. The stab-in-the-back myth blamed Jews for Germany's defeat. The Nazis turned this into genocide. German territorial losses created the Sudetenland crisis, the Polish corridor dispute, the Anschluss with Austria. Every crisis that led to 1939 had roots in Versailles. Reparations destabilized the Weimar economy, created hyperinflation, enabled Hitler's rise. The disarmament clauses made German rearmament after 1933 look like restoring violated rights rather than preparing for war. Everything connects. World War I didn't end in 1918. It metastasized and spread beyond Europe. The Middle East as we know it was created by World War I. The Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916 divided Ottoman territories between Britain and France. Artificial borders. Arbitrary states: Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Palestine. The agreement was secret treaty, negotiated while Britain was promising Arabs independence in exchange for revolt against Ottoman Empire. T.E. Lawrence, Lawrence of Arabia, led Arab forces believing they were fighting for Arab kingdom. Instead, they got British and French mandates. The Arab Revolt of 1916-1918 saw Arab forces fight alongside the British against the Ottomans. They captured Aqaba, Damascus, and other key cities. They believed they were creating independent Arab state. Instead, Sykes-Picot drew lines on a map dividing the Middle East into British and French zones of control. The borders made no sense. Iraq combined 3 Ottoman provinces with different ethnic and religious compositions: Sunni Arabs, Shia Arabs, Kurds, into single state. Syria and Lebanon were carved out of Greater Syria. Jordan was created as kingdom for the Hashemite family Britain had promised Arabia. Saudi Arabia emerged from Bedouin conquest. None of these borders reflected pre-existing political entities. None corresponded to ethnic or religious divisions. All were imposed by European powers for European interests. The Balfour Declaration of 1917 promised British support for a Jewish homeland in Palestine, without consulting Palestinian Arabs, created the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that continues today. The declaration was single paragraph in letter from British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour to Lord Rothschild. Britain supported the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, with the caveat that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. And these promises were contradictory. How could Palestine be both Jewish homeland and protect Palestinian Arab rights? The British didn't reconcile this. They made promises to multiple parties, hoped to sort it out later, and created a conflict that has lasted over a century. European mandates in the Middle East were colonies by another name. Local populations who'd fought for independence got new masters instead. Resentment built. Nationalism grew. Anti-Western sentiment became structural. The modern Middle East's conflicts, sectarian violence, authoritarian regimes, Western intervention, terrorist movements, all trace back to how World War I carved up the Ottoman Empire. In Asia, Japan's participation in the war on the Allied side gained it German Pacific territories, gave it taste for expansion, led to invasions of China in the 30s, to Pearl Harbor in 41. Japan had used the war to expand its influence in China. The 21 demands of 1915 demanded Chinese concessions that would have made China Japanese protectorate. China resisted with Allied support, but Japan gained German territories in China and the Pacific, and gained confidence that Western powers wouldn't seriously oppose Japanese expansion. At Versailles, Japan proposed racial equality clause in League of Nations covenant. Wilson and Lloyd George rejected it. They couldn't accept racial equality when their empires were based on racial hierarchy. Japan's delegation was humiliated. Japanese nationalists argued this proved Western hypocrisy, that the West would never treat Japan as equal, that Japan must create its own sphere in Asia. In India, British promises of self-government in exchange for war support went unfulfilled. Indian soldiers fought at Gallipoli in Mesopotamia on the Western Front, came home to continued colonial rule. Independence movements accelerated. India contributed 5 million soldiers to the British war effort. They fought in every theatre, suffered heavy casualties. Indian taxpayers financed much of Britain's war costs. In return, Indians expected political reforms, eventual self-government, recognition as equals within the empire. Instead, they got the Rowlatt Acts, repressive legislation extending wartime emergency powers. They got the Amritsar massacre, British troops firing on unarmed protesters, killing hundreds. They got broken promises and continued subjugation. Gandhi's non-cooperation movement emerged directly from this betrayal. The independence movement that would eventually end British rule in India was radicalized by World War I's broken promises. Worldwide, colonial subjects who'd bled for their imperial masters demanded recognition, demanded rights, demanded independence. World War I broke the legitimacy of European imperialism, took 60 more years for the empires to actually fall, but the rot started in 1914. And in Russia, the Bolshevik Revolution created the Soviet Union. Communism as state system, the ideological alternative to capitalism, the Cold War's foundation. Lenin came to power because the war destroyed the Tsar. Stalin built totalitarianism using war-era techniques of state control and mass mobilization. Soviet expansion after World War II followed patterns established in World War I, security through territorial buffer, distrust of the West, military-industrial economy. Everything that defined the 20th century, World War II, the Holocaust, the Cold War, decolonization, the Middle East conflicts came from World War I. The war didn't end the old world, it created the modern one. But what actually died in that war? Not just empires, not just millions of men, something deeper. Some fundamental assumption about human civilization. Before 1914, progress seemed inevitable. Technology improved life, democracy spread, international trade connected nations. War between great powers seemed obsolete, too expensive, too destructive, too irrational. The Edwardian and Belle Epoque eras represented peak of this optimism. Electricity was transforming cities, modern medicine was conquering disease. Mass education was spreading literacy. Women were gaining rights. Labor movements were improving working conditions. Democracy was expanding. The future seemed brighter than the past. Then Europe's most advanced civilization spent 4 years feeding their youngest men into industrial slaughterhouses. The Enlightenment promise broke. Reason didn't prevent catastrophe. Science enabled it. Progress meant better ways to kill. Art reflected this. Dada emerged from the war's absurdity. Surrealism from its psychological damage. Modernism from its shattering of old certainties. The Lost Generation writers, Hemingway, Remarque, Sassoon, Owen, described a world where traditional values were obscene lies. Dada began in Zurich in 1916. Artists and poets, refugees from the war, gathering in the Cabaret Voltaire, creating anti-art. Nonsense performances, random assemblages, rejecting logic and reason because logic and reason had created the trenches. If rational civilization produced such insanity, then irrationality was more honest response. Hugo Ball performed sound poems, nonsense syllables chanted while wearing cardboard costume. Marcel Duchamp exhibited a urinal as sculpture. The point was rejection of meaning, of tradition, of the cultural values that had led to catastrophe. Surrealism emerged from Dada but went deeper. André Breton's Surrealist Manifesto of 1924 argued for art based on dreams, on unconscious, on the irrational parts of mind that civilization suppressed. The war had shown that civilization was nightmare. Perhaps dreams were more real than so-called reality. All Quiet on the Western Front, published 1929, captured it best. Young German soldiers who believed the patriotic lies, who discovered war was mud and fear and meaningless death, who came home broken to a society that couldn't understand. Erich Maria Remarque wrote from experience. He'd served on the Western Front, been wounded, seen his friends die. The novel described soldiers who learned that their teachers had lied, their parents had lied, their society had lied, that the grand words, honor, patriotism, glory, meant nothing in the trenches. That war was just industrial murder. The book's final scene shows the protagonist killed. On a day so quiet, the army report says, all quiet on the Western Front. His death means nothing, changes nothing, is just one more casualty in a war that had already lost meaning. The Christmas truce of 1914, when British and German soldiers left their trenches, sang carols, played football together, became unbearably poignant. It showed what was lost. That soldiers on both sides were just men, that the war was insane, that stopping it was possible. The truce happened spontaneously along sections of the Western Front on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day 1914. Soldiers began singing carols, shouted Christmas greetings across no man's land, gradually emerged from trenches, met in the middle, exchanged gifts, cigarettes, food, buttons, buried the dead together, played football with improvised balls. For a brief moment, the shared humanity was visible. The absurdity of killing each other was obvious. Men who had no personal quarrel, who could share Christmas celebration, were supposed to kill each other the next day. Some refused. Some units maintained the truce for days. Officers suppressed it. Orders came down. No fraternization with the enemy. Artillery bombarded areas where truces were occurring. Soldiers were rotated to prevent relationships forming. The war resumed. And yet it continued for 4 more years. Why? That's the question that haunts World War I. Why did soldiers keep fighting? Some argue coercion. Deserters were shot. Some argue nationalism, genuine belief in their cause. Some argue comradeship, loyalty to the men beside you. Some argue there was no choice. Once committed, withdrawal meant defeat, and defeat meant everything was wasted. Probably all of these, probably different answers for different men, but the larger question persists. Why did civilization allow this? The war killed 10 million soldiers and accomplished nothing. The map changed, the empires fell, the debts piled up, and 20 years later everyone did it again. Worse. What did World War I prove? That modernity was a lie. That progress was myth. That beneath civilization's surface, humans remained tribal, violent, and irrational. Or that civilization itself, the nation-state, the alliance system, the military-industrial complex, the ideology of honor and sacrifice was the problem. The soldiers knew. The poetry tells you. Wilfred Owen, killed 1 week before the armistice, wrote, My subject is war and the pity of war. The poetry is in the pity. He described the old lie. Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. Sweet and fitting to die for your country. Owen's poem, Dulce et decorum est, described watching a soldier die from gas attack. If you could hear, at every jolt, the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud of vile, incurable sores on innocent tongues, my friend, you would not tell with such high zest, to children ardent for some desperate glory, the old lie, dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. He'd watched men drown in poison gas, watched them die screaming. There was nothing sweet about it, nothing fitting, just young men choking on their own melted lungs because old men's diplomacy failed. Siegfried Sassoon, British officer, published a declaration in 1917. I am making this statement as an act of willful defiance of military authority because I believe that the war is being deliberately prolonged by those who have the power to end it. Sassoon had been decorated for bravery, had won the Military Cross, was respected officer. His statement argued that the war's original objectives had been achieved, Belgium was avenged, Prussian militarism was checked, but that the war continued because governments couldn't admit it was pointless, because profiteers made money from it, because pride prevented settlement. They didn't court-martial him, they sent him to psychiatric hospital, called it shell shock. Couldn't admit a decorated officer might be right that the war had become pointless slaughter. The soldiers knew, the poets knew, the broken men in hospitals knew. But the generals kept sending them over the top. The politicians kept demanding victory. The newspapers kept printing patriotic lies. And the war ground on until November 11th, 1918, when it finally stopped. Not because anyone won, not because objectives were achieved, because Germany collapsed internally and couldn't continue. The armistice wasn't peace, just exhaustion. What remained? Shattered countries, traumatized populations, economic ruin, political extremism, and 10 million graves. The tomb of the unknown soldier became World War I's symbol. In Arlington, in Paris, in London, graves holding unidentified remains. Could be anyone, could be your son, your brother, your father, because so many were never identified, blown apart by artillery, buried by shell fire, lost in mud, decomposed beyond recognition. Identification was often impossible. Dog tags were introduced but could be lost. Bodies were destroyed beyond recognition. Multiple soldiers died in same shell blast. Their remains mixed together. Who was who became unanswerable. The graves registration units had grim task. After battles, they searched for bodies, documented what they found, tried to identify remains, buried soldiers in military cemeteries when possible, but often there was nothing to find, or nothing that could be identified. These became the missing, the men who went over the top and never came back. No body, no grave, just absence. The Menin Gate in Ypres lists 54,000 names, all missing. All British and Commonwealth soldiers who died in the Ypres salient and have no known grave. 54,000 names carved in stone. It's not complete. There wasn't room. Another 35 or missing from Ypres are listed on other memorials, nearly 90. All 0 men who died in one area and simply vanished. The Thiepval Memorial lists 72 0 or more missing from the Somme. Every one a person, a life, a family that never knew what happened. Did he die instantly? Did he suffer? Was he buried? Or did he simply cease to exist, erased by artillery? The French have their own memorials. The Ring of Remembrance at Notre Dame de Lorette lists 580, 00 names, French, British, German, all nationalities who died in Nord-Pas-de-Calais, listed alphabetically without regard to which side they fought for. In death, the distinctions ended. The British tomb of the unknown warrior in Westminster Abbey contains remains of unidentified soldier exhumed from the Western Front, chosen randomly from 6 bodies, so even the selection committee didn't know which battlefield he came from. France, Belgium, anywhere. Every mother who lost a son could believe this was him. The selection process was careful. 6 unidentified bodies were exhumed from 6 different battlefields: Ypres, the Somme, Arras, Cambrai, others. They were brought to a chapel in France. A blindfolded officer selected one. That body was placed in a coffin made from oak from Hampton Court Palace, transported to Britain, buried in Westminster Abbey on November 11, 1920, exactly 2 years after the armistice. The funeral was massive. Crowds lined streets. The coffin was carried on a gun carriage. Every branch of service was represented. The king attended. Every organization that had lost members sent representatives. The tomb was filled with soil from French battlefields. The gravestone is black Belgian marble. You can't walk on it. There's no path across. Every visitor must walk around. This unnamed soldier receives more honor than kings buried nearby. France created its own unknown soldier, buried under the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. America selected unknowns from different wars, buried them in Arlington. The tradition spread worldwide. Every nation that fought created tombs for unknowns, because every nation had missing. Every nation had families who never got closure. The unknown soldier represents democratic sacrifice, not a general, not a noble, just a soldier. Could be anyone. Probably was nobody important before the war. Factory worker, farm boy, shop clerk, someone who would never have been memorialized individually. But representing all of them, he became most honored casualty of the war. And the power of the symbol is that he's still unknown. We still don't know which battlefield that soldier in Westminster died on. We don't know his name, don't know his story. He remains every soldier, every loss, every grief. The unknown soldier represented all of them. The individual swallowed by industrial war, the man become number, the person erased by history. Every November 11th we remember, 2 minutes silence at 11 a.m. Poppies worn in Commonwealth countries, veterans' ceremonies, speeches about sacrifice, and every year the question gets harder to answer. What were they sacrificing for? Not freedom. Both sides were imperial powers. Not democracy. Russia was autocratic. Germany was monarchical. Not defense. Most countries involved chose to enter the war. They died because Europe's great power system failed, because nationalism trumped reason, because military planning created momentum toward war, because once started, stopping became impossible without admitting everything was wasted. They died in a war that didn't need to happen. That accomplished nothing worth its cost. That created conditions for worse to come. This is World War I's real legacy. Not heroism, not sacrifice. Warning. Warning that civilization is fragile, that progress can reverse, that the mechanisms we build to prevent catastrophe can cause it instead. The alliance system meant to prevent war triggered it. The military plans meant to ensure quick victory guaranteed long stalemate. The peace treaty meant to prevent future conflict created it. Every solution became a problem. And here's what should terrify you. We haven't fixed any of it. Modern alliances, NATO, mutual defense treaties, operate on the same logic as 1914's alliance system. Attack one, attack all, meant to deter war, could trigger it. Modern military planning still assumes quick victory, still underestimates what happens when assumptions fail, still creates momentum toward escalation. Modern peace agreements still impose terms that breed resentment, still create conditions for future conflict, still prioritize punishment over reconciliation. We remember World War I. We wear the poppies. We honor the dead. But we haven't learned the lesson. The lesson isn't that war is hell. Everyone knows that. The lesson is that war can happen despite everyone knowing that. Can happen despite no one really wanting it. can happen because systems we create to manage conflict can make it inevitable instead. World War I wasn't caused by evil, it was caused by normal, by nations pursuing security through alliances, by militaries planning for contingencies, by leaders making decisions that seemed reasonable at the time, and it killed 10 million people, destroyed 4 empires, created conditions for fascism, communism, and World War II. This is the war that ended the old world. The 19th century's optimism, the belief that civilization meant progress, that rationality would prevent catastrophe, that modern nations were too advanced for barbarism. August 1914 shattered all of it. And what replaced the old world? The 20th century, the bloodiest in human history, world wars, genocide, nuclear weapons, total war, ideological extremism, all flowing from the choice made in summer 1914, the choice to let one assassination become continental war, the choice to keep fighting after the Marne proved quick victory impossible, the choice to measure success in corpses and progress in yards, 10 million dead, for what? A map that changed, empires that fell, a peace that failed, a treaty that guaranteed the next war, for what? There's no good answer. That's the point. There is no answer that makes sense of the Somme, of Verdun, of Passchendaele, of all those names on all those memorials in all those small towns across Europe, Passchendaele, Third Battle of Ypres, summer and fall of 1917, British offensive in Belgium, fought in rain that turned the battlefield into swamp. Soldiers drowned in mud, wounded men who fell into shell craters sank and suffocated. The advance gained 5 miles in 3 months, cost 325,000 British casualties, accomplished nothing strategic. Passchendaele was hell's refinement. Verdun and the Somme were terrible, but at least the ground was solid. Passchendaele was fought in liquid mud. The Flanders Plain is low-lying, artificially drained by centuries of dikes and canals. The preliminary bombardment destroyed the drainage systems. Then the rain came, and kept coming. The battlefield became swamp. Shell craters filled with water. Soldiers advancing across this terrain had to pick their way between water-filled holes. One wrong step meant falling into a crater. The weight of equipment pulled you down. The sides were slippery. You couldn't climb out. Your friends tried to help, but they were under fire. Often they had to leave you. You drowned in a shell crater, in 3 feet of water, mixed with chemicals and decomposing bodies, while the battle moved on around you. Wounded men faced worse fate. If you were hit and fell into a crater, you had minutes before the mud sucked you down. Your comrades might not reach you in time. Even if they did, pulling you out meant exposing themselves to fire. The calculus was brutal. How many men risk death to save one wounded soldier? Sometimes the answer was none. Sometimes wounded men were left to drown because saving them would kill the rescuers. The mud swallowed everything. Artillery pieces sank until only the barrels showed. Tanks became stuck and were abandoned. Mules carrying supplies struggled and died, sank into the mud, became part of the morass. The duckboard paths, wooden walkways laid across the mud, became lifelines. Step off the duckboards and you might sink. Stick to the path and you were visible target. The attack lasted 3.5 months, July through November. The Canadian Corps finally captured Passchendaele village in November, giving the battle its name. They took a destroyed village on a low ridge, the strategic objective. It meant nothing. The following year, Germany recaptured it in a day during the spring offensive. All those casualties for temporary possession of worthless ground. Field Marshal Douglas Haig's Chief of Staff visited the battlefield for the first time after the battle ended, saw the mud, broke down, said, "Good God, did we really send men to fight in that?" Yes, you did. For 3.5 months, 325 dual British and Commonwealth casualties, 200,000 German casualties. Over 500,000 men dead, wounded, or driven mad for 5 miles of swamp. The small memorials are the worst. Every town in France, Belgium, Britain has one. Lists of names, boys from the same village, the same street sometimes, all dead in the same battle, the same day sometimes. Walk through any small town in northern France. In the centre there's a memorial, sometimes a statue of a soldier, usually just a stone monument, always a list of names. Morts pour la France, died for France. The Great War, 1914, 1918. Then the names. The lists are long. Towns of a few thousand people lost hundreds of young men. Do the math. Every young man of military age gone. Some towns lost more than that. Volunteers, multiple age groups, casualties across 4 years of war. The demographic impact was catastrophic. Small farming villages lost the men who would have worked the fields, married the women, raised the next generation. Instead, the women remained unmarried, the lost generation of women who outnumbered men because the men were dead. Fields were worked by widows and daughters. Families died out. Villages emptied. In Britain, the PALS battalions created concentrated tragedy. Sheffield raised a battalion from one factory. Grimsby raised one from fishermen. When these units were destroyed, and many were on the Somme first day, entire communities lost their young men at once. The Accrington PALS suffered 584 casualties on July 1, 1916, including 235 dead in about 20 minutes. Accrington was a town of 45, year 0. News of the losses shattered the community. The town effectively went into collective mourning. The demographic and economic effects lasted generations. The memorials record this, long lists of names from towns that couldn't afford to lose them. Jones after Jones, Smith after Smith. Sometimes brothers listed sequentially, sometimes fathers and sons. Older men had volunteered alongside their sons. All dead, every name a person, a life unlived, children never born, futures erased. The memorials are our attempt to remember individually what happened collectively, to give back the names that the war took away when it turned men into casualty statistics. The Thiepval Memorial to the Missing of the Somme lists 337 names. All missing, no known grave, just names carved in stone. It takes hours to walk past all the names. You start reading them. Realize each is a person, a life, a family who never knew what happened. You stop reading because it's too much. They died for nothing, for a failure of imagination, for an inability to stop once started, for leaders who couldn't admit the war had become pointless, and soldiers who couldn't refuse orders. This is what we remember on November 11th, not glory, not victory. Waste. The waste of an entire generation, the waste of 4 years. The waste of civilization's promise, and the knowledge that we could do it again. That's World War I's lesson, not that war is terrible, that we know. The lesson is that knowing isn't enough, that we can slide into catastrophe while trying to prevent it, that the systems we trust to keep us safe can kill us instead. The trenches are tourist sites now, preserved, educational. You can walk through reconstructed sections, see the barbed wire, the sandbags, the duckboards. What you can't see is the smell, the fear, the mud that swallowed men whole, the rats that fed on corpses, the constant shell fire, the screaming, the dying. What you can't hear is the silence after. When the guns finally stopped. When survivors emerged and looked at what they'd done to each other. When they realized it had all been for nothing. That silence echoes still. Every November 11th. 2 minutes at 11 a.m., remembering the war that ended the old world and created the one we're still living in. The one where we know war is insane, where we build systems to prevent it, where we promise never again, and where we keep the mechanisms that could make it happen anyway. That's the legacy, that's the warning, that's what died in Flanders fields. Not just men, not just empires, The belief that we're too civilized for this, the confidence that progress prevents catastrophe, the assumption that knowing better means doing better. World War I killed all of that and showed us what we're capable of when the systems fail and the momentum builds and nobody can stop what's started. 10 million dead, 4 empires gone, a continent in ruins. And 20 years later, we did it again. Remember that when you see the poppies, when you hear the silence, when you think about sacrifice and honor and the war to end all wars. Remember, it didn't end anything, it started everything. The 20th century, the modern world, the knowledge that civilization is always one failure away from collapse. That's what happened between 1914 and 1918. That's what World War I means, not a historical event, a warning about what we are, what we're capable of, what we could become again. The trenches are empty now, the guns are silent, the soldiers are dead, but the lesson remains, and we still haven't learned it.